Hello again. As you can probably tell from the title up there, this time I'm going to be talking about Scott Pilgrim, specifically about the film adaptation of Scott Pilgrim, and specifically about some issues that I had with it. I want to preface this by saying that I love the Scott Pilgrim comics. They're definitely not what I'm criticizing here. I first read the comics around the time the movie came out because I wanted to, know what the deal was with the movie before I saw it. And I think since then I've read them 4 times probably. My point is that I'm completely in love with those comics and I have very, very few issues with them. The issues I do have are with certain decisions that Edgar Wright and the rest of the people who worked on the film made in the adaptation. And I know this isn't the most relevant thing to be talking about right now, considering the movie came out, almost 3 years ago, and the comics came out way, way before that. But this is something that I can talk a fair bit about, and it's also kind of tangential to that piece on geek culture that I'm planning on writing. I think I mentioned it last time. But the main thing the sort of main problem that I had with Scott Pilgrim vs. the World, the film, was how much was missing. How much was sort of trimmed and stripped out of it from the comic to the film. And I understand why that happened. I mean, it's mostly because the comic takes place over the course of about a year, and has 6 volumes, whereas the film, of course, can only run for a certain amount of time, and the time frame for it was, I think, like a few weeks, maybe about a month. And so it had to be slimmed down, it had to be streamlined to be a film, and I get that, but I think that some of the decisions that were made in what to cut had more of an effect on the story than the writers may have actually thought. And I think some of it is almost unforgivable. I think some of it, actually, the story doesn't even work without. To elaborate, I think the central point where all my issues with the film come from is the character of Ramona. And I think, first of all, her character in the comic ran into a couple of snags in the first place, mainly because as a character, Ramona has to do 2 jobs. She has to be one of the main characters of the story, and also has to be sort of a plot device that keeps everything moving, because nothing that happens in the comic would happen without her. The whole thing with her exes, and Scott having to fight them, and how that ties into her backstory and Scott's backstory, and a bunch of development for everybody, it all comes from Ramona. And so I think a consequence of that is that her character ends up being a little bit underdeveloped. And I think Brian Lee O'Malley, it's not too big of an issue. I think Brian Lee O'Malley did what he could with her character and developed her as much as he could, but the fact that she's a character and a plot device did have some consequences. But that goes into analyzing the comic, and that's not what I'm doing, at least not right now. But I think the issue I had with Ramona in the movie was, I mean, really, first of all, I didn't like the cast. I didn't like Mary Elizabeth Winstead as Ramona. I thought she definitely looked the part, although that, I mean, obviously that has a lot to do with the costume design for that movie, which is also fantastic. But I think she definitely looked the part, and I can see why she'd be chosen. But I don't really like the way she plays the character, because I think that Ramona in the comics is obviously supposed to be sort of distant and detached and sort of apprehensive about becoming close to people and opening herself up to people, and as the comic goes on you find out why. But I think Winstead kind of overcompensated in that area in portraying the character, and I think Ramona comes off as, to be honest, kind of bitchy for a lot of the movie, and there are points where I found myself thinking that somebody watching the movie without being familiar with the comics would kind of wonder why she's worth all of what Scott is going through. And the comics make that much clearer. But I think her performance, combined with some of the other things that were in or not in the movie, made for kind of a shoddy portrayal of the character of Ramona, which, as I said, has far-reaching consequences for the rest of the film simply because she's so central to the plot and to everything that goes on. I think that there are a few subplots, as I said, that they removed from the film that were integral to it, and perhaps the writers of the film didn't realize that. Or were... I understand that when people make movies like this, they're always trying not to alienate people that aren't familiar with the source material, and so they don't want you to have to do research, and they don't want to, reference a bunch of stuff in the narrative without justifying it. And the thing with Scott Pilgrim is that one of the reasons the comic is so good is because it's full of subplots. It's full of side stories and character development of even background characters, and like little things that are, threads that go on throughout the entire comic and have payoffs toward the end. And I understand that some of those could have been removed, and a lot of them were, and there are some things that are just matters of opinion. Like, I was ticked off that they didn't include a very large part of the movie that comes from Volume 3 of the comics, because 3 is my favorite volume. And I was sort of annoyed that they didn't include the whole subplot with Todd cheating on Envy with the drummer for Clash at Demon Head, and some of the story elements that come from that. And they also didn't go very far into Scott and Envy's history. And really, Envy's not nearly as important to the movie as she is to the comic. And so I was sort of ticked off at that, but that's just because Volume 3 is my favorite, and I wanted to see that, and I personally was disappointed not to. But the story still works if you lose a lot of those elements. So that's an example of one of the things that they cut that disappointed me, but it could be cut. Like, the story can go on without it. A counterexample of something that was cut from the film that I think the story cannot happen without is a very large part of Roxy's story, and all of the things that happen between Scott and Ramona during what in the comics is Volume 4, because that's a very big part of Scott and Ramona's development as characters and as a couple, because there's the whole thing that happens where they finally, after dating for a while, they finally have like a serious fight. They end up going their separate ways. Scott ends up spending the night with that girl that he knew from high school, and then you find out that Ramona ended up spending the night with Roxy. And Scott has this realization when he wakes up the next morning that Ramona is worth fighting for, that he really does care about her, and that despite the fact that he was so afraid to fight Roxy when she first showed up, which, it should be noted, in the comic is because she has a sword and she seems really dangerous, as opposed to in the movie where he's pretty much just squeamish about fighting her because she's a girl, which I thought was kind of lame. But it means that Scott makes that realization that despite how frightened he is of fighting Roxy, she's worth fighting because he cares that much about Ramona. And when he confronts Ramona about that, you can sort of see that Ramona has come to a similar realization. And that's why, in Volume 4, the fight between Scott and Roxy isn't even a central part of the comic. It's a 2-page spread. It's only one scene. But, like, despite the fight itself being so simple, it's one of the most important fights. It's also, in the comic, it's when Scott gets his sword. He gets the first sword, because it's when he realizes that he loves Ramona, so he gets the power of love. In any case, all of that is obviously very, very important to the story. It explains a lot of practical things, and it also gives Scott and Ramona a lot of much-needed development, and a lot of understanding for the reader of why Scott is willing to go through all this for this girl. And that, all of what I just described, is completely absent from the film. Roxy's appearance, I think she shows up maybe once, kind of early in the film, and then she shows up again when he fights her. And all of that is over fairly quickly. It's handled clumsily. It's rushed, and like it added to my disappointment at that, because I think that's when the movie stops following the comic and kind of starts doing its own thing, which was another issue with it, because the film did follow the comic almost exactly, almost frame by frame, line for line, followed the comic up until Todd is defeated. And after that, everything kind of goes off on its own path, and I think that's where the biggest issues with the movie begin. As I said, there's the whole thing with Roxy. I think that without that development for Scott and Ramona, it reinforces what I said earlier, where Ramona just doesn't really seem that grateful for what Scott's doing, and she doesn't seem like somebody that he would care that much about staying with. And the fight that they have after Roxy is defeated kind of makes sense, but not in the way that it's supposed to. And Ramona leaves, seemingly out of anger at Scott, because that's the way the narrative goes in the film. Whereas at that point in the comic, when Ramona goes away, it's obviously for different reasons, for things that are tied into Gideon and his whole plan, which, as I said, is absent from the film. And also just duties that Ramona feels that she has, but none of that is represented in the movie. Mostly in the movie, it's just a fight between the two of them. And also, it's another personal thing, but I was just a little bit ticked off that Scott doesn't start getting angry about what he gets angry about in the movie until he finds out that one of Ramona's exes was a girl. I always thought that was kind of... but, again, another issue, not what I'm talking about. But the other issue with the second half of the film, and really, I think the easiest way to sum it up is just that without the subplots and all the secondary character development for the first half of the story, because all of that is absent from the film, the second half of the story doesn't work the way it's supposed to. It doesn't gel. There doesn't seem to be much of a reason for a lot of the things happening. And the movie kind of tries to have substitutes for the secondary things that happen in the comic, but they're underwhelming because they aren't the elements from the comic that had been built up for 5 volumes. And so, for example, as I said, Envy is a much smaller part of the story in the movie, and she isn't who's performing at the Chaos Theater at the end. It's Sex Bob-omb, who have been signed by Gideon, and Neil has replaced Scott, which is something that kind of happens in the comic, but in a very different way and at a very different point. But that's another thing that you lose at the end, is that you lose the element that Scott is rescuing Envy just as much as he's rescuing Ramona. And that's very important to Scott's character because of what I mentioned before, the whole concept that he, in a way, is overcoming his own exes. But that's, as I said, a more complicated thing. So there's the fact that Envy isn't there, and that removes an element from the story that was there in the comic. There's the fact that Gideon's whole plan involving the glow, which is completely absent from the film, and the mind control technology that he was developing, and how that leads to the fact that he's been gathering all of his ex-girlfriends over these years, and Ramona is so special because she's the only one that the glow didn't work on, and all of that, which leads to a very epic, and in the comics, much more cathartic confrontation between Scott and Gideon, where Scott has to realize that he's defeating Gideon for himself, and he's not doing it for Ramona. And that's one of the character's big realizations that he has after the whole aside with Kim when he goes to visit her when she moves, which is also not in the movie at all. So you lose, I suppose, a lot of the weight of Scott going to confront Gideon. And again, they kind of try to touch on that in the movie, that he's doing it for him, not for Ramona, but he just says that. In the comic, you really see it, and you really understand it. And one of the other big issues with that ending, that also, as I said from the beginning, ties into the character of Ramona, and the absence of Gideon's plot, is that it is never really given too strong of an explanation why Ramona is with Gideon. There's a tiny reference to a chip that's on the back of her neck, and it's implied that it's wired into her brain, and Gideon has some limited control over her mind, which is sort of lame, because that makes sense, that story element makes sense if you have the rest of his plot, and you know what the glow is, and you know why she's unique, but none of that is there in the film. So it doesn't really make a strong enough argument for why Ramona goes back to Gideon, even though she claims that she was done with him. And again, it makes Ramona, in the movie, come across as kind of indecisive and apathetic and just not a good person. And that's not the way that she's supposed to be portrayed. And all of that just sets up one of the worst failures of the movie, which is the very ending. And the very ending is essentially the same. Very ending, I say like the last thing that happens. It's essentially the same as the comic. Ramona opens a door, she plans on leaving, she sort of assumes that she's done with Scott and all the things that have happened there, and that Scott is done with her, but he tells her that he's not, and he wants to go with her, and they leave into subspace together. That's how the comic ends, and it's also how the movie ends. But the problem is that in the movie, that ends after some really confusing sequences with Knives. Because Knives' plot in the film is also totally different by the second half. And long story short, it's a little late for that, I guess, but long story short, the biggest problem with the ending is that you really think that Knives belongs with Scott. That they would go much better together for a lot of reasons. Particularly there's the fight where both Knives and Scott are fighting Gideon for Ramona, like while Ramona is freeing herself from his control. And it shows, it recalls some scenes from the beginning of the movie of them working together, and that scene does a very large amount to make it look like Scott and Knives are perfect for each other, and that they've taken the whole movie to realize that they should be together, which would be great if that was the point, but it's not. That's not the point at all. That had nothing to do with the comic, and I don't think that was even really Edgar Wright's intention with the film, but it's definitely the way it came across. And the overall tone that gives the movie is basically that Scott chooses Ramona when he could have Knives, because Ramona is off-putting and distant and doesn't treat him that good, but she's mysterious. And so he kind of goes for her rather than Knives, who would obviously be the better choice. And a lot of people dislike the movie because of that overall tone to it. And that frustrated me because the comic is nothing like that. The comic does completely different things with Scott and Ramona's relationship, and with Knives and her development as a character. She has her own story arc. But that, I think, was the biggest issue, was that it imparts kind of a statement that is very negative. It's very removed from what the comic was trying to say, and it doesn't even make sense to other parts of the movie. In any case, I suppose I've talked about this for quite a while, and it hasn't been the most cohesive, but as I said, the whole point of this is just for me to get my thoughts out there, and if you think something about it or have something to say, then feel free, and if not, then just ignore me, which you probably are anyway. Take care. I'll be back next week.